All right, welcome back, everyone. Today is May 3rd, 2019. The first weekend in May for a few years now has pretty much been the Christmas, so to speak, for nerd culture. And the reason is because, well, think about what's going on culturally for us who like kind of the nerd things. This weekend, these are the things that are going on. First off, last week in Avengers Endgame was released, the culmination of 22 movie or 21 movies and 11 years of films. Last week came out, and this week it's going to continue. Last week it had made $350 million in the United States, $1.2 billion worldwide. It was quite an impressive rake in. And it was a great movie. I'm going to get to that a little bit. Spoilers abound in this one. Uh, but anyways, that was last. That's going big right now. Tomorrow is May 4th, which, if you're a Star Wars fan, it is known as May the 4th be with you. It is Star Wars Day, and I just actually read recently that apparently the state of California actually officially is recognizing it as Star Wars Day. And then on top of that, go to your local comic book shop. It is free comic book day. Now, I'll talk about that in a little bit later, about some complications with that. But it is free comic book day. If you have a comic book shop nearby, go get yourself a free comic book. And then keeps there's even one more thing going, and that is on Sunday is the fourth episode of Game of Thrones. 3 episodes remaining of its series finale. That the episode that we just had last week was intense, but Sunday is Game of Thrones. So there's a lot of stuff for people that are nerd culture, such as I would consider myself to be. And so I'm going to talk about several of these things. I'm going to start with the fact that tomorrow is Free Comic Book Day. Um, I follow a lot of different comic book creators on my Twitter feed. I follow people like, Paul Dini, Brian Michael Bendis, uh, Jim Palmiotti, Alex Ross, Jim Miller. Those are some of the comic book creators I follow. And Jim Palmiotti, I think that's how you pronounce his name, I posted last week, especially at the release of Avengers Endgame, about the question of what could we do to strengthen the comic book industry, the comic books themselves. And especially in the midst of the discussions that have been rumored from Disney that they're going to shut down the comic book end of it and only focus on the movies. And, I think it's a very important, worthwhile discussion. And I do wish and hope that kids would, people would engage in comic books. You can't quite see. I'm going to bend back my chair a tiny bit. Right behind me, you can see 2 comic books, a little bit. You can see Batman 1000, Detective Comics 1000, and right over there is Jessica Jones Volume 1 by Brian Bendis. And I encourage comic books are a great reading source. And if I was sitting over on behind with my other bookshelf behind me, you'd see some other stuff like that, other comic books. And it's a good discussion. What do we do to keep the comic book industry? It is something to survive because the artwork you see, in particular, the artwork, the writing, um, that you find in comic books is something to embrace and to keep going. And so the questions come, what do we do to keep it engaged? I think having a free comic book day is a big help. It gets people in the comic book shops that probably wouldn't otherwise, and maybe they get a few comic books or at least a graphic novel or two. But there's a couple other things that I kind of think about that would be helpful. One is something I think that the movie industry could do, and Marvel Cinematic such a small little touch, is I don't totally love the modern Marvel Cinematic logo, the Marvel Studios logo. When Marvel Cinematic started, when they did the whole Marvel logo, they'd scroll through these comics for old comics, and that's all you saw. I loved that because it was an acknowledgement of where the comic books originated, where the source material of these movies. But that hasn't happened. Now that's not what they do anymore. Now what they do is they show a little bit of the comic strips and then they roll into the images of the movies. Now, in part, I understand this because they're showing off the incredible franchise they built. But the thing is, do they really need to? People know about that. People know. They're coming to the movie probably because they've been going through this journey. But you're going to have more and more people are going to forget that these are these incredible stories. I mean, Infinity War, Avengers Endgame, they don't happen without the incredible comic book source material. The very notion of getting rid of Marvel comics is stupid because you're getting rid of some great stories. They could make good movies and good TV series. And with Disney Plus coming out, they're going to need some of that great material. I mean, the Netflix Marvel series is definitely advantaged. I mean, the Daredevil show was so good. You know, all three seasons, especially the first and third, were just incredible stories, incredibly well written, incredibly well directed. So there's that. And so that's the reason why the movies, you know, the studios got to show their appreciation. They got to show their support. Um, you know, maybe even do something, get creative a little bit. The movie Logan, which I think, in my opinion, it's even as much as I like Avengers Endgame and some of the other Marvel Cinematic Universe, the movie Logan is my favorite comic book movie. And one of the things in that movie, there's this scene where you actually get a little bit of a highlight of the old X-Men comic books. It's such a creative way to remind people that there is a comic book origin. And what if, you know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and they'll squeeze them in somehow, showed a little moment, show the comics like they did with the movie Logan, acknowledging where this all started, where it all came from. And this is going to be even harder with Stan Lee gone. If Stanley has died, passed away, you're not going to have that comic book face like you used to have. So they're going to have to come with ways to acknowledge and remind people where this came from. Then the other thing, and this is the other part, this is so Free Comic Book Day, what are the struggles it is going to have? So I said, you know, you could go to your local comic shop. Well, I live in Ida Grove, Iowa. We don't have a local comic book shop. The closest comic book shop is an hour and a half away in Sioux City. And honestly, if you're coming from Ida Grove, it's not really easy to get to comic book shop. I mean, yes, it's on a main street downtown, but you have to go up and around. It's on a one way that's going the opposite, you know, going the wrong direction. And so it is kind of a pain to get to it. And so for me, I haven't been there for probably a couple of years. And that is the big problem with the comic book industry. The biggest challenge is accessibility. Where can you go to buy comics? Comic book shops is the only place, but unless you have them, I mean, you could do a subscription service. Like I actually did that for a little while. So, I mean, there's that. Barnes and Noble occasionally sells something, but even there, Barnes and Noble is an hour and a half away. What do you do to engage the rural areas? Because right now, rural areas have no access to comic books, to comic or graphic novels. And so this is where really Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Marvel Studios, Disney, which has the pull to do it, or DC, who's owned by Time Warner, they have the pull to do it too. Make deals with Walmart, make deals with Target, Kmart, grocery stores, Walgreens, CVS Pharmacy, all kinds of places. Find places where people who live in rural areas are going to be, and so they can get comics. The comic book industry is going to struggle if people don't have access to them, if they can't get them. And yet, yes, you could get digital comics. I have some of them, but it's not the same. I love kids. Kids in today are still artistic. There are still kids that love good artwork. I watch some of my high school youth and see the drawings that they like to do. I see the things that they like to create. So there's artistry. It's not something that's dead. That's why a physical comic book always will have appeal, because of that artwork. You can't display an iPad. Not very well. It gets really expensive if you want to always display one item. I love that right now on my shelf I have this great cover of Jim Miller. It's a Batman number 50. It's Batman and Catwoman. The wedding comics, this beautiful pencil drawing that he's got. If I ever meet Jim Miller, did I say Jim Miller? Mixing Frank Miller and Jim Lee. Jim Lee. Whew, I think I did that a few times. Look at Jim Lee drawing, and I love to get that autograph by him. I apologize, I called him Jim Miller the whole time. But anyways, without comic books, without access to comics in rural areas, small towns, if it continues to be the case where you have to go to a town of 50,000 people or more, like a Sioux City and Omaha, Sioux Falls, Des Moines, Ames, whatever, to get comic books. In the state of Iowa, that is a huge gap of the state that has nothing. If you wonder why the comic book industry is struggling, right there. You have a huge gap of our state, and I guarantee it, we're not the only ones in that situation that have absolutely no access to graphic novels, to comic books. The comic book industry has to figure out a way to make it available to the to more of the population. And it's as simple as that. And that was actually much of the problem when I was growing up. But one of the biggest things that got me out of comic books is when I originally first started collecting comic books, I bought them from Hy-Vee in Ankeny, and where I grew up. Well, Hy-Vee and other grocery stores slowly phased them out, and they disappeared. And then it became the only place you could buy them was a comic book shop. And for a little while, there's a comic book shop in Ankeny, and then it disappeared, and we never saw it again. No comic book shop. And so with no comic book shop until Rodman showed up well after I was out of high school. That's for years. A town, one of the fastest growing cities in the country, there's no access to comic books. That speaks to kids. And the thing is, you have to engage kids. Kids can't go to the place where these comic book shops are. I know some people happen to be in towns where they can, but most of us aren't. So, like I said, the industry has to come up with a way to do it, because that's the reason why, yes, it's Free Comic Book Day tomorrow. And I might think as kids are in our congregation, I love to encourage them, go get a comic book. Go check out Free Comic Book Day. But where are they going to go do that? They don't have any place. That is a problem. And comic books are worth reading. It is worth kids reading them. It's worth reading into the fantastical stories to express their creativity. And they're reading stories. And there's people, you could read studies and resources as to why comic books are good for kids to read. I honestly believe teachers, schools should actually tell kids it's okay to read a graphic novel for book reports. It sounds, I mean, when I grew up in school, it's like, no, that's not real reading. I'm like, something like, no, I wouldn't recommend this for a small kid, but something like Watchmen or The Dark Knight Returns, those actually would be really good book reports. I mean, they're graphic novels, but there's some really good stuff to dig into. Um, so, I mean, now I wouldn't just say one little itty bitty one issue of a comic that would be enough content, but a graphic novel I think would be really worthwhile. There's story, there's narrative, there's character development, there's all kinds of things to dig into, and some of those stories it's kind of now probably when you're in high school or junior high you're not going to be thinking about this stuff, but there is definitely some serious philosophical and worldview issues to be engaging with when you're reading some of these graphic novels and these comic books. And like I said, they are seriously engaging stories and characters. So, with all that said, there is comic books are everywhere these days, and the most obvious example is Avengers Endgame. Came out in theaters last Friday or Thursday night. I saw it at the premiere at 6:30 down in at Crawford Cinema in Denison, and then I saw it again the day after at Southern Hills in Sioux City. And I'm going to tell you, the first time and the second time, I absolutely loved this movie from beginning to end, and I cannot wait till it's out on DVD because I want to watch it again. And I want to be able to sit there and watch Infinity War and Avengers Endgame back to back in one setting without having to go drive somewhere to go catch one of them. I want to sit down and watch it because it was so well done from beginning to end. Now, as I say this, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that the movie doesn't have flaws. It definitely has flaws. It's a 3-hour movie. And so much happens. And it's coming off of Avengers Infinity War, which ended up, one of the rare moments in a superhero movie, where the superheroes actually lost. They were defeated. I mean, wow. How many movies end with the good guys in defeat? And so that cliffhanger was so awesome. And the movie, and then Avengers Endgame begins right where pretty much where that left off. And the first scene you see is Hawkeye, Oh, by the way, case, I'm going to say it right here. Everything I say from this point on will be spoilers about Avengers Endgame. It has been in theaters for a week. I know there's a lot of people who have not seen it yet. And I understand life is busy, it's chaotic. For some of you, it may be yet another week or two or maybe a month before you see it. Whatever the case, I'm giving you the warning now. Spoilers. I am going to reveal stuff that happened in this movie. So, with that being said, spoilers. If you have not seen the movie, pause, go watch it. If you haven't seen it, you don't care that's spoiled, well, it's your loss or whatever. So, with that being said, the movie begins with that opening scene where, so like I said, at the end of Avengers Infinity War, all of the characters, or actually half of all existence was disintegrated. It ceased to exist, was wiped out when Thanos, snapped his finger, the Infinity Gauntlet. The movie Avengers Endgame begins with Clint Barton, who is Hawkeye, teaching his daughter to shoot a bow and arrow. And as you watch this, you know exactly how this scene is going to end. You know it's going to end with at least one of his kids disappearing and Hawkeye left behind. Well, in the end, it ended up being all of his kids disappeared. Now, the only complaint I have in this scene is because I knew the minute I saw this scene, the minute it's opened up, I knew that this was like, oh no, man, this is going to be tough. Ended up not being as tough of a scene as it should have been. And I say should have been because this should have been a really emotional, right out of the gates moment. But it wasn't really because they made one critical decision flaw. Hawkeye should have witnessed them being disintegrated, dusted, or whatever you want to call them. And I say this because I think the most gut wrenching thing would have been, she shot the bow and she made it the first time. Like, and he goes, "Hey, why don't you try it again?" He's kind of teaching, right? Remember what I said? Pulled back, and as she's about to fire, or maybe just as she shoots it, she does. Let him see it happen. This would have been very powerful in making this an emotionally traumatic moment. And it really even more empowers what happens with Hawkeye. Is he lost all of them. I mean, all his entire family. And so I mean, it's not like the scene was bad, but I think they could have gone right for the jugular, right out of the gates for the fans, for the audience, but they didn't go there. I wish they had. Um, the next scene you have, which is, I think, a great character development scene, not just for Tony Stark, but for Nebula. And it's one of the scenes that made me really like Nebula as a character even more. And so it is Tony Stark and Nebula are on the ship, trying to get back to Earth, after everyone else was disappeared. And so they're trying to get back to Earth, but they've apparently ran out of fuel and they can't. They're just floating in space, hoping that something good will happen. Well, you see the scene where Nebula and Stark are playing paper football, and Nebula's kind of getting frustrated or getting excited with it, which is a nice little moment. But the really good character building moment, and this is something that gets highlighted, especially with the way the movie ends, is that when Tony is losing oxygen, he's saying that he's probably going to die due to lack of oxygen, today, in the day that he's recording this. Well, Nebula, when he has passed out, Nebula goes to him because Nebula can last a little longer, probably due to all the things that her father had done to her. And she picks up the passed out Tony and gently sits him down in the chair in the cockpit. And I thought this was such a touching and compassionate moment, almost motherly, for Nebula, who is a character that throughout her story arc, her character arc, has been notably cold and unsympathetic or empathetic for anybody. And yet here she's being very motherly. And in case you'd forgotten the type of character she is, the end of the movie you will see old school Nebula, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But I thought this is a very touching little moment. Well, in the end, they end up getting saved by Carol Danvers, um, who is Captain Marvel, and she she carries the ship back to Earth. And this is where you get to see the Avengers get to meet her, and they come up with a plan that they're going to go and get Thanos, which they do. They get on a plane and they fly. They get on a ship. They fly to Thanos to go kill him. And you see that Thanos does not put up any type of a fight. And his head is removed, which this is the beginning of a highlight about Thanos, which I'm going to deal with a little bit later. But Thanos, that you see in the beginning of the movie and at the end of Infinity War is not the same as the Thanos you're going to see by the end of the movie. Well, they kill him, but when they do, they realize they cannot reverse what he has done. And they realize that they are stuck in this situation. They are stuck in the post snap world. And they live in it for 5 years. And 5 years later, and I think this is a good move to do a 5-year jump. So you could see the consequences of what Thanos had done. And, then it's about this time that Ant-Man gets out. He's released ultimately by a rat. So really kind of almost the hero of the story is a rat. But hey, maybe one day that rat becomes Splinter because he walks through some mutagen. But anyways, so Ant-Man gets out of the quantum realm. He discovers the world as it is now, half less the population. He sees his daughter Cassie, who's now 17 years old, which you realize how difficult that's got to be, that he missed such critical years of his daughter's life, and now who was this sweet little girl, now she's a teenager. That's got to be tough character wise. And then he goes, and this basically sets up the need to go back, figure out that how to go back in time. And Ant-Man, played by Paul Rudd, is the one. Scott Lang, played by Paul Rudd, is the one who comes up with the idea or the game plan, and Tony Stark comes up with the science of it, of how to go back in time. And along the way, you meet an overweight alcoholic Thor, which some people begrudge. They feel like it's a lot of fat jokes. If you can't tell, I'm not a skinny guy. So I know what it's like to deal with weight issues. And losing weight is a challenging thing. Or maintaining that weight loss. But here's the thing is that Thor's character is notoriously good shape. Throughout the series, I mean, he's just got this very, very good physique, very incredible physique, which is why seeing him in the condition he was, it's not so much about making fun of fat people, as some people have suggested. It's actually about to highlight just how far gone he is. Is that, I mean, think about this. He is the god of thunder. He is the one that could do incredible things. He had Stormbreaker. He drove that axe in the heart. And when he hit the heart, he could have pulled it back up and swung on his head. But no, he decided to press it in farther to create more pain. But because he was angry, he wanted revenge. He wanted to make Thanos suffer. And when he was the one that had the best opportunity to keep Thanos from completing his plan, his anger caused him to fail. And then when they went and tried to undo it, they couldn't. So with all his power, with all his strength, with all his might, he could do nothing to undo the damage Thanos had done, which makes sense as to the reason he ends up the way he is. Then you have Hulk, who is both Bruce Banner and Hulk, which is kind of intriguing. And it shows what Hulk is like if he has Bruce Banner in his head. So he's super strong. But because he's Banner, he doesn't have the off-the-charts aggression, which means he doesn't do quite the amount of damage that he would do when he's just Hulk. And this gets really highlighted when they go back in time. So they go back in time, which ends up being a really cool move where they chose to go back in time, because it ends up being almost a homage to what they had done, what Marvel Cinematic Universe had done up to this point. 21 films, 12 years or 11 years. This is the culmination of all of it. And so they go back to the moments in Avengers. they go back to, um, so they go back after the pokey stick, which has the Mind Stone in it. They go after the Tesseract, which has the Space Stone in it, and Banner Hulk goes after the Time Stone, which is the possession of the Ancient One, which is a call to some of the stories and the events of Doctor Strange. And the conversation between Banner and her ends up being kind of an intriguing one, an interesting one, and one that kind of helps us sort through a little bit more of the time travel conundrums. Uh, then you had War Machine uh, and Nebula. They go to Morag to in order to get the Power Stone, and so you get to see one of the opening scenes from the original Guardians of the Galaxy movie. And at first, you get to hear the music, you see him dancing, which is kind of fun and kind of nostalgic. And then they switch over and they show uh, Peter Quill singing with the headphones on, so you don't hear the music. So it's kind of a humorous little moment. Uh, you have Thor and Rocket. They end up going to Asgard to get the Red Stone. What is that called? The Reality Stone. And this leads to a nice little conversation between Thor and his mother. And again, people complain about this, like, why would you do this? It's like you have to realize where they were actually going to the one spot that really had the least danger. And so it's not totally unrealistic, unforeseen, problematic that he talked to his mother. I mean, his mother was murdered. And you're telling me that if you saw your murdered mother alive, you wouldn't go try and talk to her because you missed her? It makes sense what he did. Everything with Thor made sense there, character wise. So, they get the stone, they succeed pretty well. Um, when War Machine and Nebula go, they get the stone, but the complication is that Nebula gets linked into the Nebula of the time that they're in. So the Nebula of 2014. And this basically is the moment that kind of sets up the final act of the film. And our Nebula gets swapped out for the Nebula of 2014, which was much more brutal and cold-hearted, which again is demonstrating the character development in Nebula right before our eyes. And you even see a little bit of what Gamora was originally, because you get to see it pre Guardians Gamora. And meanwhile, the Avengers, the recap of Avengers film from 2012, Captain America and Thor, and Iron Man, Captain America, Iron Man, and Ant-Man are trying to go get the Tesseract and the Mind Stone. And the Mind Stone is retrieved with little difficulty. The one that ends up being the challenge is getting the Tesseract. And they needed a Tesseract, and they also need more Pym particles, which allow them to go back in time. And this ends up setting up a really nice moment where Tony was able to have a nice conversation with the young version of his father. Interestingly, at the same time that his mother was pregnant with him, and ended up being a very touchy scene. Captain America got to see Peggy Carter for a little bit, and you even got a quick moment where you got to see the character Jarvis from character and actor of Jarvis from the show Agent Carter. From Agent Carter that came out a few years ago, had 2 seasons. From there, and then there was the really tough one. There's the Soul Stone. Now, if you saw Avengers Infinity War, you should have known something was going to happen. Because in Avengers Infinity War, in order to get the Soul Stone, you had to exchange a soul for a soul. And the soul that got exchanged in that one was the Gamora of the Guardians of the Galaxy. And she's dead. She's dead for good. This time it is Hawkeye and Black Widow who are there. And the moment I did not see coming in this film was Black Widow's death, her being killed. And I did a rewatch of the entire MCU leading up to this, and I remember I was recalling how much I loved Black Widow as a character. And seeing her die, it so sucked. I mean, I don't mean sucked like that was a bad decision. I mean, it was emotionally, that was a tough scene, tough moment because it came out of nowhere. I didn't expect it. And her death, the way they showed it, it was brutal. They made sure to let you know it was definite. She was dead. And so, and by the way, watching it a second time, knowing that she would be the one that wouldn't return, it became much more difficult when just before they leave, she makes a crack like, "Hey, I'll see you guys in an hour," and she is the one that you don't see again in an hour. Ooh, tough scene. Well, it's at this point they build a new gauntlet, they snap the fingers, and they snap everyone into existence again. And there's a call from Hawkeye's wife, so he's able to talk to her to know that it worked. But it's about this time that Thanos' ship, along with his entire army, come blasting through the portal, the time portal, and the final act, the final battle breaks out. And this battle was just absolutely epic. I mean, it starts out, it's just a battle between Thanos and so it's Thanos versus Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, and it is a great battle and it's a fun one. It's exciting. You can tell they're against our heroes are against the ropes. It's showing that Thanos is the strongest character, most powerful character in the universe. And there's this one point where, and then the really, really cool moment, it's a moment that got foreshadowed in Avengers Age of Ultron, was that, Thor is fighting against Thanos, and they're kind of showing the hammer. It's shaking like it's about to move. You think that maybe Thor is going to grab it, he's going to use both weapons. Well, he doesn't. The hammer goes flying past Thanos and ends up in Captain America's hand, which it said is a callback to Avengers Age of Ultron, where there's a scene early in the movie where all the Avengers are standing there seeing who can move, who can lift the hammer. Well, there's one little moment when they get to Captain America where he grabs it, and it moves just slightly, letting you know that there's a possibility he might have moved it. And Thor's eyes kind of make this little acknowledgement like he knew. But Captain America, probably in humility, chose not to move it. Well, this leads to really cool fighting. He's got the sword and he's got the hammer and in one hand and the shield in another, and so the battle got more interesting. But eventually Thanos is just whooping on him, and he just decimates the shield. Well, then the army comes, and it looks absolutely, utterly hopeless. And I love the moment where Cap stands up, his shield is destroyed, and he is a bloody mess. He's been beaten pretty badly. This huge army standing before him, and all of a sudden he comes over his intercom. Help is on its way, and it sounds like Falcon. And all of a sudden, all these portals start opening, and this massive the army of Wakanda, led by Black Panther, the army of the sorcerers, all these people come out from the portal, and you realize that this is on. The battle is about to begin, and it is, that moment. I remember the first time I saw it, people legitimately cheer, like, yeah! It was so awesome the way they did it. It kind of reminds me of Lord of the Rings Two Towers, where in the battle for Helm's Deep, the they feel absolutely hopeless. And all of a sudden the sun starts to rise, and they recall Gandalf saying, "On the third day, look to the east, to the rising of the sun." And of course, that's when Gandalf shows up along with this huge army of horses and the riders of Rohan, and they charge in and they win the battle. That's kind of the way this scene ended up playing out. Very similar, and very similar feeling. Yeah, here they come. You felt like hope, and then here comes this army that you've been anticipating. And the thing is, the fact that they arrived the way they did is actually an acknowledgement of realize how important Doctor Strange was, because and Spider-Man later acknowledged this as, so I was dust. You remember I dusted, I disappeared, and all of a sudden I show up again. It's almost like I just took a nap, and 5 years. It's been 5 years, and Doctor Strange is there, which means Doctor Strange knew. I mean, Doctor Strange knew exactly what was happening, and the minute he came back into existence, he moved right away, and he got everyone together, which shows how important Doctor Strange was as a character, even though it was a bit subtle. And meanwhile, Thanos, the battle just goes epic. But the thing is, the movie does not let you lose track of the fact that Thanos is dangerous, how powerful he is, and as many heroes as they have. And I love Valkyrie coming in on the horse. That's kind of cool. And just the visual of it, it just was so epic, an incredible battle scene. Well, but in the midst of that, Thanos is holding his ground, and they are struggling against him. The only person that really got a kick licking on him, and that was Scarlet Witch, where she has him up, and she's just crushing him, doing some severe damage on him. And at which point, he starts firing from the ships. And shortly thereafter comes Captain Marvel, who obliterates the ship, which was admittedly kind of cool. And which, speaking of Captain Marvel, I think they did a very good job of handling her, because they were right not to make her over featured, because she is very much the new player, new gal, new player in town or whatever. And so it was good that they used her. They used her, I think, just right. They used her in a way that made her important, made her of significance, allowed her to have some high key moments, but they didn't overemphasize her, which would have been given the fact that she is new. She is a new character. They did it just right with her. And she fought. She was able to at times fight decent with Thanos, but you also kind of get the indication at moments that Thanos can handle her too. And that was something important. I mean, yes, he knocked her out with the Infinity Stone one of the times, but he also did some damage to her at some points too, because they did not let you lose track of the fact that out of all of them, Thanos was the most powerful, more powerful than even Captain Marvel. That had to be the case, because remember, in Guardians of the Galaxy, there's this moment where it was said to Ronan, this is Thanos, the most powerful being in the universe. And that's without any Infinity Stones. And given the fact that we learned from Captain Marvel that Ronan had seen Captain Marvel, you cannot make Captain Marvel the most powerful being when you've already established as a movie through a character of Ronan who's already seen Captain Marvel in action that Thanos is the most powerful being in the universe. You can't all of a sudden make him not. And they did a good job of keeping it that way. And so Thanos put up a battle. By the way, interesting thing with Thanos is what they did character wise is in Infinity War, the Thanos you get at the end is much more, it seems to have a level of compassion. And I think this has to do with the Soul Stone. Not just the stone itself, but the fact that he had to kill Gamora to do it. And, and so this is why you notice in this fight, his battle on the planet Titan, you can't help but notice that he puts up a fight. That is, he's fighting. He speaks in terms of respect to the heroes. He speaks in terms of respect to Iron Man. He says, "You will be remembered for your bravery, for your fighting, or your courage, or whatever." The Thanos you get in Endgame says that he's going to enjoy doing what he's doing, which means that something about the Soul Stone changed his character, changed the type of person he was, which is an interesting little tidbit of character development. And so in the end of the movie, the hero ends up being Iron Man as he gets a hold of the stones and he snaps out Thanos and all of his army out of existence. And as you see early in the movie, I mean, the Incredible Hulk got severely hurt holding that glove. The only person, as far as we could tell, that could snap that glove without anything hurting him was Thanos. And so you knew the minute Iron Man did that, you knew he was probably dead. And that's exactly what happened. He died from snapping, he died saving the entire universe. And this, people kind of had a suspicion ever since Infinity War was announced that Iron Man or Captain America were going to die, especially given the fact that their contracts were up and they plan to do no more movies. And that's what happened. Iron Man ended up dead. And his death worked. And I loved that the last words between him and Pepper was not "I love you," but Pepper said, "You can rest now." And I thought that was such perfect words because earlier in the movie, he was talking to Pepper and said, I can't do this. Maybe I should throw this idea out into the water and I'll go take a nap. And she says, but you won't be able to rest. As long as you could do something and there are these type of things going on in the world, you can't rest. And so that moment she says, you can rest now. He gave it his all to stop this evil. And then there's this huge victory scene where people are celebrating the defeat of Thanos and his army. And the scene was very reminiscent of Return of the Jedi. After the Emperor and the Death Star were defeated and destroyed, you had the Ewoks celebrated. And in the newer versions of the film, you see these images across the galaxy as people celebrating. And it felt very similar at the end of Avengers Endgame. And they segue into the funeral. And the moment that, I was making through this movie the whole time. I was not really tearing up or anything, but it was an emotional roller coaster. But the moment that got me choked up, the first time I should say, the second time I was worse. I was actually got emotional quite a bit. But the first time, the moment that got me was they show this wreath, and on it is the first arc reactor that Tony built in the cave in the original Iron Man movie, and it was in the form of the plaque that Pepper created for him, and it says, "Proof that Tony Stark has a heart." When I saw that, that got to me. It's like this character that you've watched for 11 years through all these movies, his journey. I mean, this is a guy who started out so selfish, wasn't willing to die, willing to put up the sacrifice. And this was a huge thrust to the argument between him and Captain America in the film Avengers. And in the end, he did just that. And his death, that wreath, was the reminder, the proof that Tony Stark had a heart. It was no longer the reactor that was the proof. It was the funeral that was the proof. And they went through and they showed all the characters, and they were so mourning his death, and included the kid from Avengers 3, and Iron Man 3, and I didn't know that until I saw some stuff on the internet. I was like, who's this kid? And then I read the internet, and they said who it was. And then you had Captain America, the other one that everybody knew was going to be leaving after this movie. And so and there's some details I noticed before this scene was, so Cap and Bucky are having a conversation, and they're talking like Cap is going to be gone for a long time. Well, for Cap, it's going to feel like a long time, but not for Bucky. It's only going to feel like a few minutes. So why are they talking like it's going to be forever? I mean, Bucky even says, it's going to be weird to have a world without a Captain America. It's like, that doesn't make sense. Well, when I saw it the second time, all this actually made sense. Is that Bucky knew what Cap was doing. In fact, everything that's going on pretty much alludes to the fact that they had a conversation prior to Captain America going back, prior to Steve going back. And I love that before they leave, there's this little moment where Bucky says to him, "Don't do anything stupid. Don't do anything stupid while you're gone." And then he says, "How can I when you're taking all the stupid with you?" Something like that. It's a callback to a moment in the first Captain America film. And so he goes back, and Hulk says he blew past his timestamp. But before that happens, you see Bucky turn, and he looks at a specific spot. And the reason he does that is because he knew where he would be. They had the conversation. And he walks towards him. And he stops. He doesn't go to the bench. Why doesn't he go to the bench? Because he knew what was going to happen. He let Falcon go to him and talk to him. He made sure Falcon was, because he knew that now the mantle of Captain America was to be passed on to Falcon. So Falcon got the shield. Where did he get the shield from? I don't know. Part of me is wondering if it isn't the prototype shield that was referenced in Spider-Man Homecoming. I'm wondering if it isn't that one. But either way, he's given the shield. And some people wonder, why not Bucky? Why didn't Bucky get the shield? And it actually makes sense narrative-wise. For one, it had to be a soldier. I think it had to be somebody who was a soldier to hold that shield. And so, yes, your obvious options had to either be Bucky or Falcon. Well, the problem with Bucky is his past. It's granted he didn't actually do any things. He was brainwashed, but while he was brainwashed, he carried out some pretty high-profile assassinations. And I mean, Avengers Civil War, Captain America Civil War, the splitting of the Avengers was all centered around uh, Bucky. And so it makes sense that he would not be the one. And so they give it to Falcon, the one who seems like the logical choice, the best choice. And I do look forward to what they're going to do movies wise. I hope they do joint movies with those two because they have great chemistry that was definitely seen in the Civil War film. So it was, I loved Avengers Endgame. It was so good on so many levels. It was an emotional roller coaster. There's moments I cheered, there's moments I cried out of grief and sadness. There is moments of beauty and tenderness, especially, you can't help but love that the last scene was Captain America finally having that rain check, that dance with Peggy Carter, and that was the best romance in the entire MCU was the relationship of Peggy Carter and Steve Rogers, and can't help but love that beautiful closing shot. And I mean, it did so much well. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say it was perfect. There's definitely flaws here and there. There's definitely some plot holes to be dealt with, and there's questions: what happened to um, Loki when he snatched away that um, the Tesseract? There's questions like that, but altogether, it was a great movie. I loved every bit of it. So, and there's definitely some philosophical, even theological things I could talk about. I'm not going to. I don't want this to hit an hour. So there you go. There's my thought. Free comic book day. Avengers Endgame. I love this movie. If I were to give it a scale of 5 stars, I would say it's a five out of five. And right now, and granted, I'm still only a week away from it, and it's still too fresh in my mind. But at the moment, it is my favorite event Marvel Cinematic Universe movie to date. And I think I like it more than Winter Soldier or Guardians of the Galaxy, which typically have been my favorite movies. But right now, this is my favorite. Who knows? Maybe a few months down the road, I watch it again. That might change. It may be Winter Soldier again. But at the moment, it's my favorite. So that is what I have for you this day. So there you go. Avengers Endgame, free comic book day. What do we do to get comic books popular again? Make sure it keeps going. And in my previous video, I talked about the WWE Pro Wrestling. So I hope this has been enjoyable to you, and I pray a blessed Friday, Saturday, weekend to you. God's bless. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you, be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you, give you his peace. Amen.